In 1952, the Soviet Union entered the Olympics for the first time. Their daily newspaper, Sovietsky Sports, wrote, "Every record won by our sportsmen, every victory in international contests, graphically demonstrates to the whole world the advantages and strength of the Soviet system." These were not empty words. The Soviet sports machine would become one of the most dominant forces of the 20th century, and amidst the Cold War would draw both awe and intrigue from their allies and their enemies alike. In just their 9 Summer Olympics, the USSR racked up 1,010 medals and still have the highest overall count in some areas. And right now, more than 3 decades after their fall, the West still speaks about the tightly mechanical and scientific approaches of the once world juggernaut. How could you deny it? The proof is in the pudding, it's right there. The supremacy of Soviet systems is self-evident and their methods must be learned and adopted. Well, that's what many will say at least. So how dominant were the Soviets really? Was there really a secret Soviet formula, or is it just a figment of Western imagination? We're going to break down in 5th grader terms exactly what the methods were. We're going to explain if they were overpowered or overrated, and give the blueprint to using the good stuff while ignoring the rest. As always, this video is brought to you by Barbell Apparel. If you've got chonky lifter legs like I do, finding jeans that fit might be a bit of a chore. These are, without a doubt, the most comfortable, versatile, and dare I say, stylish jeans on the market. And you know, they got some Bromley merch, so that's pretty cool too. Link is in the description. Now back to the show. When you start looking at the numbers, the Soviet Union's grip on sports and strength is really hard to overstate. Look at the count from their run from 1952 to 1988. The USSR as of today still stands at 2nd place in all-time medal counts for both gold and overall. They have the 2nd most gold medals in track and field and are still number 1 in wrestling and weightlifting. Remember kids, this is a nation that hasn't been around for 34 years. The Soviets had manufactured an Olympic gold medal goose that resulted in the obliteration of records and the straight redefining of human potential. Since their participation was a tool for Cold War propaganda about communist supremacy, it's no shocker that strength and power development would be at the center of their focus. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in some of the most powerful human beings to ever live. On the list of Soviet greats, you have Yuri Sedykh, who still has the hammer record of 86.74 meters 40 years later. You have Valery Brumel, who broke his own high jump world record 6 times between 1961 and 1963. You have Viktor Saniev, who dominated the triple jump for over 12 years with 3 consecutive gold medals, followed by a silver. You have wrestler Alexander Medved, who's the only 3-time freestyle Olympic gold medalist in history. And you have the most dominant athlete, Larissa Latynina, who holds the record for most gold and overall medals by a gymnast. But remember, for the infant nation of the Soviet Union, representing the image of strength was the sole purpose for their investment in the games, and this specific branding wouldn't be as effective if it was promoted by a lanky runner. The biggest, brutest, strongest man in the world would have to be a Soviet if they were going to make a statement, and in that department, they left no stone unturned. One of the clearest examples is Leonid Taranenko's legendary 266 kilogram clean and jerk at the 1988 World Championships. At 586 pounds, that number has stood the test of time. Decades later, the only person to have beaten this in competition is Georgian giant Lasha Talakadze, who at 6'6" and 400 pounds, was a mite bigger than Leonid, and he only beat it by a whopping 1 kilogram. That's not exactly what you call progress. Anatoly Pisarenko is legendary for his stoic demeanor and iconic grainy black and white photos. I'm ashamed to say that I am directly using Soviet propaganda in my videos, but damn it, that is just some good composition right there. He was a 3-time world champion who was rumored to have gotten close to a 600-pound clean and jerk in training and snatched well over 450 pounds. He did this at a body weight of 265. As a 198-pound athlete, David Riggert clean and jerked 507 pounds and pressed 443. And then there's Soviet great Vasily Alexiev. Uncle Vasily looked like he trained for the Olympics after polishing off a six-pack, but before going out to chop wood. I really wish this guy would have been in a beer commercial next to Bruce Wilhelm and Don Reinhardt. He won 8 consecutive world championship titles between 1970 and 1977. He won 2 gold medals in the Olympics. Remember, they're only held every 4 years. And he was the first to clean and jerk 500 pounds. He eventually pressed it. Now, there's obviously a reason, a cause that allowed for this type of vulgar display of power and dominance. But the question is, what exactly? Now, let's clear something up before we start getting our bellies full from lapping up that red commie glaze. The creation of the Soviet Union was fueled by a rush to fulfill their collectivist ideals. And that involved taking a very large unskilled workforce and putting them to work with quantity as a priority over quality. This made Soviet synonymous with shoddy. They had a command economy where they could point the finger at a particular industry, flip a switch, and suddenly have everybody working to produce on that one thing. While that certainly had some benefits, you better hope the people in charge had an airtight plan and effective communicating skills. They, of course, didn't, which means that they went into World War II without sufficient fuel, ammunition, or vehicles, and had to rely on horses. In the age of the atom bomb, our allies against Nazi Germany were using horses. Now, of course, we swept in and provided them with 150,000 good old-fashioned American Studebakers, which were so reliable, Stalin personally sent a letter of appreciation to the Studebaker Company. At the time of the first Olympic appearance in 1952, the Soviet Union was only 30 years old, but so far, it had experienced the Red Terror, the Russian famine, dekulakization, another famine, the gulags, the Great Purge, and the Katyn Massacre. The USSR didn't even survive 70 years before crumbling, and the number of deaths directly related to the government are estimated at 28 million on the low end. Now, I gave you this history lesson and hopefully a bad taste in your mouth to say that there should be a few miles of skepticism you go through about the brilliance of anything Soviet before you give an inch of belief. We're going to cover the work of these lifters and scientists indifferently, but I'm not going to bury the lead here. There's no honest investigation into Soviet sports that will leave you feeling a sense of brotherhood with your fellow comrades over the awesome power of communist ingenuity, athletic or otherwise. There's certainly some good stuff here, some takeaways that you can use, but there is just so much bullshit. So to sift through it, we've got to get down to what the actual methods were, and that means grabbing a big shovel. Now, what set the Soviet sports team apart from other countries was its commitment to science and structure at every single level. This sounds good at first. According to Greg Nuckols of Stronger by Science, the Soviets in the Stalin era loved top-down long-term planning. Sometimes it worked out well, i.e. their incredibly rapid expansion and modernization, or their manufacturing and energy sectors post-World War II, for example. And sometimes it worked out horrendously, i.e. the Soviet famine of 1930 to 33. The original impetus behind periodization was simply the Soviet long-term top-down planning fetish applied to sport. So this feature of having a plan at the top and then white-knuckling control for every single decision all the way down the chain was so baked in that the science became ingrained into the sports themselves. What I mean by that is that many of the scientists were actually world-class athletes. You have Bondarchuk, who's an Olympic gold medalist in the hammer. You had Medvedev, who held a world record in the snatch, and Vorobyov, who had a gold medal in weightlifting. Now, this entire journey into methods starts with the father of periodization, Leo Matviev. Leo gave the first real comprehensive framework of periodization, and he used a retrospective analysis of athletes from 1952 to 1956. This just means that he looked at who the good Olympians were, what they did, took notes on all of their training, and came up with general rules that would inform what people should do in the future. And this is where we see a lot of the stuff we have today emerge. You have a specific timeline to get ready for a contest. If you're in the off season, you might be 6 months away, and you separate and label your training into different periods denoted by micro, meso, macro cycle. It's just obnoxious nerd speak for a training week, a training block, and the entire preparatory period. And then you move forward in a predictable stepwise fashion. You start with more generalized training stuff and you do a lot of it. Then you move to more specific stuff and you do a lot of that. And then finally, as you peak, you do less of it so you can recover and you come in refreshed, dialed in like the edge of a samurai sword, and you go to work. Now, I got to give this guy's flowers. This was actually really important, especially in really complex sports where you have to pair a bunch of different stuff together. A football player has to be good at like 12 different things. And if you're just training them all together, kind of however you feel, you're not going to get as good of results as if you put them on a calendar and make sure you're putting first things first. Like I said, it's intuitive, but the Soviets weren't satisfied with practical or intuitive. When asked about the secret of Soviet success, it's often been explained as measure everything. Every set and rep, the total and average tonnage of the workout, absolute and average intensity, number of lifts, distribution of work at specific percentages. I mean, they went deep, and it looked like you needed a math major in order to pull apart the vague and hidden patterns in the mess of numbers that would make up training tables. The results just got really complicated really fast. But first, let's take a look at the charitable takeaways because there certainly are some. For one, you have an immense focus on technique and specialization. Now, this seems obvious, but even today, there are brilliant athletes and successful programs that get away with loose technique. Even in strength training, you have the "it'll be fine" crew when your back starts to look like a vomiting caterpillar. The Soviets drained every ounce of efficiency from their athletes through highly specific repetition to turn them into athletic machines. Biomechanics played a huge role here. Number two, there was a high volume of lifts between 70 and 85%. Medvedev found that the weights used in training by successful lifters followed a normal distribution curve, meaning that you could predict that most of the good work was going to be in this 70 to 85% range. Of all these athletes, only 5% of the lifts were done above 90%. And of those, you would rarely see something like an actual 1-rep max. Third, you had variability over progression. Now, this is a key difference between the East and West. As Pavel himself said, in the West, the key word is progression. In the East, it's variability. So where we like to bias towards bodybuilding type methods that just rely off effort and going harder than last time, coaches like Vorobyev and Ermakov found that rapid changes in weights and volume were actually really effective, more so than smooth transitions. And because the programs were volume-based, that created room to dramatically drop volume one workout and jack it up the next. And thing number four, they kept effort low, often very low, 1/3 to 2/3 of your actual ability within each set. So a 15-rep max you would do between 5 and 10 reps. An 8-rep max would be between 3 and 5, and so on. Now, this makes sense when you look at the technical emphasis. Repeated practice builds insane technique. It emphasizes neurological adaptations. There's less beatdown than if you're constantly chasing heavy weights, and that might contribute to longevity. So in this framework, it makes perfect sense that effort would be low. It doesn't treat strain or absolute weight as the primary stimulus. It treats the total number of good solid practice touches. Now, all of this stuff was derived from the Soviets, and it's very useful, but calling this the quote-unquote Soviet system is an oversimplification. Methods didn't always agree. In fact, they varied wildly and fractured off into different denominations. Just like churches, the spaces of uncertainty were filled with dogma. An example, we can start with legendary hammer thrower and coach Anatoly Bondarchuk, who had one of the more simple approaches to training athletes. The complex system, as it was called, referred to a complex as in a series of exercises. It used a handful of good exercises done for a few sets, but was repeated the same over and over and over, often with no variation for long stretches of time, and that applied to gym lifts and also throwing exercises.
The interesting part would be we would throw every day, and what we would do is this would be a workout. And then we'd come back in the afternoon, and we'd do this exact same workout. And then we'd come back tomorrow morning, and we'd do this exact same workout. And then we'd come back tomorrow afternoon, and we'd do this exact same workout. And then we'd come back the next day, and we'd do this exact same workout.
So this was a Soviet coach whose entire shtick was not messing with volume and intensity. Instead, he let the change in exercise drive progress and just kept the athlete doing that until they stopped progressing. This involved knowing absolutely exactly what exercises carried over and had the most transfer, because if you're going to do the same thing every day, it better damn well be a good use of time. Now, there's a rationale for doing this. It's that changing things every session, even if that might theoretically give more progress, it creates noise. So you can't pinpoint to what exactly gave you the progress you're looking for, which means you can't reproduce it later on. So if you keep the changes minimal and just track the ups and downs from each session, eventually progress would start to decline. We see this happen in lifting as well when you do the absolute same thing, and Bondarchuk would use that time period to plan individualized preparation peaks for specific athletes. It was individualized in a way that all other systems could not be. Now, this had wide sweeping impact because this is exactly what Mike Tuchscherer does, the guy who coined RPE. In his RPE-based powerlifting programs, he has his athletes do the same lifts at the same RPE. If you get stronger next week, the weights are going to go down, but the prescription is always the same. And when you see athletes steadily decline, you know what the timeline of their block needs to be. And that is rare individualization in any of these sports.
And so a lot of these ideas start with Bondarchuk's ideas on how to train throwers. And that's a bottom-up system. And that's, when I heard about it, I was like, light bulb, that's how you would do it. We're gonna take that short-term plan, we're gonna do what works, and we're gonna keep doing it for as long as it's working. And when it stops working, we're gonna do something else.
Now, even with Bondarchuk's seemingly simple application, it was said that he had 32 models of periodization labeled. 30 effing 2. At some point, you gotta believe he's just making them because he can. You Redditors that haven't PR'd in 2 years, but you've made your third Smolov 531 hybrid mashup program this month, do you feel seen now? But we haven't even gotten close to real complication. Peep the infamous super training from Melsiff and the granddaddy of block periodization, Yuri Verkhoshansky. Not only does Verkhoshansky's approach vary wildly from Bondarchuk, but he one-ups him with the level of insane, contrived, and mind-numbing complexity. Verkhoshansky was very much a white coat type dude, not a world record holder, but somebody who was up his own behind with theory. In trying to analyze every data point, he ends up theorizing on so many models that the thought of all of them being necessary, useful, or even accurate with respect to each other is absurd. But boy, can it fill up hundreds of pages in a textbook. The charitable view of Verkhoshansky's method sit at the 30,000-foot view. He took up Matviev's basic framework for periodization, which is start broad and general, do a lot of work, and then drop work over time as you get more specific. And his big contribution to that was to say, okay, but let's just concentrate our work on one or two things. That's probably more appropriate for advanced athletes, as it takes a lot more to get them to progress forward. So block periodization, a la Verkhoshansky, used concentrated loading, which just means separating traits into individual workouts and blocks, and conjugate sequence, which stack these blocks end to end in a logical order, so the improvement in one trait over so many weeks would help improve on the next block when you change the exercises. The conjugate method that I know was invented in 1950 by my teacher V. Jakoff. I'm sorry, I did like 20 takes, there's no different way to pronounce that name. It was a brilliant idea to use the special strength exercises for improving the technique of athletes. I suggested that he name it conjugate because the strength exercises have to be conjugated with the technical issues of the athlete. Now famously, Louis Simmons read through a bunch of Russian manuals and cherry-picked a lot of things that stood out to him. He took conjugate as a label to describe his West Side powerlifting system, but he ditched Verkhoshansky's entire framework by rotating the special exercises every single session and by training max dynamic and repetition effort qualities in the same week and even on the same days. Verkhoshansky addressed this directly. West Side is not actually the conjugate sequence system. It looks more a concurrent method which borrows features from other systems. It's very difficult to express a serious opinion about this matter because there is no evidence of scientific verification of its results. Soviet science burn. So if you take conjugate, which means to join together, is it the joining together of max rep and speed work in 1 week? Is it the joining together of special exercises by rotating them each week? Is it the joining of the special exercises to the athlete, as Verkhoshansky said? Who the hell knows? All I know is Louis read Verkhoshansky, named a system conjugate, and Verkhoshansky doesn't know what the hell it is by looking at it. Now this highlights a massive problem with adapting Soviet systems to literally anything else. There are huge breakdowns in communication. Now it seems likely that terminologies were shared, used, and reappropriated in the USSR in a way that would create confusion between them, because that shit still happens today. But with the language barrier of people in the West trying to adapt these dry texts into something that is usable, there is a lot of noise that's created. We're often not even sure what the program was supposed to look like. If you want to see this in action, I strongly recommend you check out the video of when Boris Shako went to West Side Barbell in Columbus, Ohio. One of these men actually came up in the Soviet system, is actually a Russian master of sport, actually trained Olympic weightlifters, and actually adapted those methods with massive success to powerlifters. And one of these guys collected random factoids the way Rain Man collects zip codes, and ended up patching together a Frankenstein's monster of nonsense. Verkhoshansky differentiates between conjugate sequence, which he was known for, which is focusing on a few traits in a particular block, and then rotating them in a logical fashion from block to block, and complex parallel training, which he says West Side might be, and I've actually heard described as well. Now, in trying to find what complex parallel exactly is, I have one source calling it the joining of two different qualities into one set, like a heavy squat into a jump, which is often called contrast training. As Verkhoshansky describes it, the complex parallel method foresees the use of different physical preparation exercises and technical exercises separately with their daily rotation during microcycles. And I'm getting mad while I'm saying this because it takes so much effort to figure out what the hell they meant, and it probably doesn't matter to anyone anyways, because if it did, someone would have made sure that we knew actually what the fuck this meant. Has anyone seen the miniseries Chernobyl? It's all starting to make sense.
In a sense, trying to piece together a comprehensive, periodized philosophy using available evidence is like looking through a keyhole and trying to describe the outside world. We get imperfect and incomplete, potentially misleading snapshots, but since these are all we have, the overriding temptation is to construct a grand, all-encompassing philosophy around woefully incomplete information.
Every time there is a thread in some forum asking about the most influential books that helped you in your training, some tryhard always puts in super training. Those people are lying. Full stop. It's like asking what self-help book really gave you the practical tools to combat the grief from losing a loved one, and they say the Tao Te Ching. It's nonsense. Nobody trains like this. But Bromley, you ask, you started this video by going off on the huge medal count, the insane dominance over decades that a country that was barely new to the world should not have been able to put together. Now it sounds like you're saying they were all full of it. So what was actually behind the performances that we see from the Soviet sports machine? There is ample reason to believe that the role of white-knuckled hypercomplex training systems were not the thing responsible for Soviet sport domination through the last century. So let's go over those reasons and talk about what we think was actually at play. Number one, talent selection. The USSR did something in the early days that only a top-down authoritarian juggernaut could actually do. And it's something that wasn't widely done then and that the United States still doesn't even do now. And that is actively, aggressively scout talent for the purposes of performing on the world stage. There's a lot of debate as to what makes the best, but just about everybody in the field readily acknowledges the role of genetic talent in separating elite athletes from everybody else. Simply put, the best program in the world won't make a mediocre player into a superstar. If you're talking about becoming the literal best on planet Earth, you got to have every ace in the deck, and it starts with how well you're built for sport. By having the full force of the government seeking out talent at an early age, they had an immediate edge, and early recruitment also meant more time to develop skills and specialize. This was their superpower. Second, and most obvious, is the use of PEDs. The Soviets are notorious for exploiting steroids before everybody else in the early 1950s, before bodybuilders even knew what to do with them. But they didn't just use them, they made the drugs as an integral part of their programming. According to sports physician Dr. John Ziegler, the first confirmed use of an anabolic steroid in international competition was at the World Weightlifting Championships in Vienna in 1954. The Soviet athletes were using testosterone, and this coincides with the spike in performance between 1952 and 1956. Now, Ziegler's observation led him to work with Ciba Pharmaceuticals to create D-Bol in pill form in 1958, which was much more anabolic and it was much easier to take. So making steroids widely available is what ushered in the golden age of bodybuilding and the spike in strength performances and general freaks in 1960s athletics. So recognizing the potential of drugs, the actual Soviet government assigned doctors to prescribe them, to manage the doses around the season, and this went on well after the anabolics were banned in 1976. If you haven't seen the documentary Icarus, stop what you're doing and go find it. It's absolutely brilliant. It follows the head of Russia's anti-doping lab, Grigory Rodnikov, to his exile in the United States in 2016 after blowing the whistle on the Russian government. According to investigative journalist Andrew Jennings, KGB officers actively undermined anti-doping efforts. There's documented cases where KGB colonels impersonated IOC officials in order to tamper with or circumvent drug tests. So having a few athletes on your team sneaking gear when they know they're not supposed to is not great, but it is wildly different than the actual machine of competition going out of their way to make sure that you can not only take drugs that other people can't, but that you can use them in quantities that they wouldn't be able to get away with. Anatoly Pisarenko was one of the best, and he had his career ended prematurely when he was caught with drugs. Vasily Alexiev had a dominant career that puttered out in the 1980 Olympics, which was the second Olympics to test for steroids. Where doping control would take effect, he ended up missing his opener. And this is common in Olympic lifting, which is one of the dirtier sports in the Olympics. It's really not uncommon to see guys get near or even above world records in training and then wildly underperform as they get to the meet because they have to change their regimen to account for testing. But the aggressive use of PEDs was only part of it. See, the USSR was doing what was called shamateurism. A lot of people don't know this, but early on there were strictly enforced rules that said pro athletes could not compete. It was amateurs only. And if you took money, you were out. American legend Jim Thorpe was stripped of his medal in 1912 for playing semi-pro baseball, and Carl Schranz was banned from competing in 72 because he took money from sponsors. I guess it was against the spirit of the Olympics for athletes to not be poor. Now, the USSR, on the other hand, well, that was just like a detail in the fine print. You could work around that. From the start, Soviets would give their athletes token professions that didn't actually mean anything. In reality, they would be training full-time through state-sponsored coaches with a stipend given money, given drugs, given everything they needed to become the best athletes possible. Why would the USSR go through all the trouble? The same reason they did any of this. It was an investment in their global reputation. During the Cold War, you couldn't get better press. So what is cutting a few corners? Fellow comrades, don't be discouraged by the tens of millions of dead bodies from our logistical failures. It was all worth it because we've realized the dream. We are now better than the capitalist pigs at throwing things. And when you consider the ability to select the genetically gifted and dump them full of drugs, also having them train as full-time athletes when nobody else in the world was, gives such an edge that if they weren't dominating people, it would be kind of an embarrassment. Now this last one is an absolute doozy. The most damning evidence that all of this complexity, that all of the millions of words written on obscure theoretical models that do not converge on one thing is actually Soviet bullshit, is the fact that there is no evidence that it actually impacted outcomes. That's right, Verkhoshansky doesn't like that the West Side methods weren't quote-unquote scientifically verified. However, there's actually no scientific evidence that any of this made the Soviet Union do any better. You can see their performance over time with these charts. The first entrance into the Olympics was in 1952 and 56, and their models for periodization came after. You had a minor improvement in 1960, but then you had a big drop in 1964. It went down again through 1968, then back up in 72 and 74, but not obviously improving on their pre-periodization numbers. Oh, but 1980, bro, they killed it. Well, of course they did. It was in Moscow that year, and the United States, along with 66 other nations, boycotted. In 1984, it was their turn, and the United States took the lion's share of medals there. As Mark Ripito wrote in the beginning of Practical Programming, the fact is that Western research regarding periodization is sparse. There are more reviews and interpretations of how to use periodization than there is data to support its use. The bottom line is that the works of Leonid Matveyev, Yuri Verkhoshansky, and Alexei Medvedev, and other communist bloc writers have been adopted as truth without independent confirmation of their theories and practices. And their practices are applied to all populations without regard to their original intended uses and intended target populations. This has always been the most frustrating thing to me about modern sports science with regard to athletic training. Periodization has always formed the quote-unquote sciencey approach to getting athletes ready, and oftentimes Olympic lifting data has just been grafted onto athletes from other sports. It will never not give me hives to see pseudo-intellectuals in the field try to take something like Prilepin's chart, which is a broad table of very vague sets and reps by percentage that was collected from elite Olympic lifters on enough steroids to kill Seabiscuit, and then try to pass it off to the general population of American lifters. This is not science, folks. Now you might see this and be a little bit disillusioned, because if the Soviet Union, a world superpower at the height of the Cold War who was dumping all of their resources into turning out the best super athletes, couldn't figure out something as simple as lifting a barbell, what hope is there for me? Well, I'm here to tell you there is hope. I've spent my entire life dragging my weak genetics to the upper limit of competition that is available to me, and I have done the same with hundreds of people that I have trained in person over my years as a coach. The methods I have are simple and accessible, and that's why they are proven and predictable. So if you're confused about training, if you're feeling like there is no hope, then I strongly recommend you go to BaseStrength.com. There you can find my books that break all of this down and give you a simple, clean template for strength that is undeniable. And if you're really wanting to make this a year that you sell out and get as strong as you possibly can, check out BaseStrength AI. This is not, hey, ChatGPT, write me a sciencey program. These are the same simple templates that I have used my entire career, that I have gotten from a consensus of the best performers in the world. The AI feature personalizes the programs to you. So all of the things that guys like Bondarchuk and Tushir were trying to do with personalizing to the athlete by reducing the noise, this does exactly that. It takes away all of the guesswork. So if you're tired of being confused, tired of spinning your wheels, then make this the year that you get strong. Go to BaseStrength.com. Link is in the description. Now with these charts, we see obvious variability year to year, but there is a close but pretty obvious edge over the United States. Now, all things considered, I think the US was actually kicking ass here and giving glimpses of what was to come. Obviously, I'm biased, but let me make my case. We turned out these performances during this time without giving up our pro athletes, without state-sponsored drug programs, without aggressive talent scouting by the government. And most importantly, we did it without the insane layers of dumb, incomprehensible complexity that was many aspects of Soviet periodization. Now, the IOC nixed the amateur rule in 1986 because obviously it was stupid and the Olympics was starting to become a lot more commercial. People wanted to see the best athletes, and the Olympics stood to make a lot more money if they let them compete. Do you guys see what's coming? That's right, baby, the Dream Team. In 1992, the United States would show the massive reserve of athletic talent that it had been sitting on by taking a roster of Hall of Famers and legends from the NBA and sending them to the Olympics. Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Scottie Pippen, Karl Malone, Patrick Ewing, and yes, the man himself, Michael motherfucking Jordan. Not only did they go undefeated, 8-0, but they won by an average margin of 43 points. The United States has a multi-billion-dollar sports complex that does nothing but satisfy the wants of consumers. And the result of that is that we routinely get the best talent in the world pulled from our population voluntarily, not by a government mandate. Into the 90s, the Olympics had added many more events. They've gone commercial, they've attracted participation from more nations, and now the medal counts would be more fractured between nations. But we still take the Olympics in gold medals every year and have only lost the overall medal count to China in 2008. Keep in mind context, China has 4 times as many people as we do. And while China's national sport is table tennis, we still have our top 3,000 athletes or so locked up in the NFL, the MLB, and the NBA any given year. And we've absolutely let go of Olympic lifting. You guys can have weightlifting. It's like the PGA of strength sports anyways.
Doing the bull dance, feeling the flow, working.
Now, many of you are not American and will be put off by my reliance on American athletic supremacy to show how bad the Soviets actually were. But maybe you'll be a bit more charitable to this. Through the 70s and 80s, Bulgarian coach Ivan Abadjiev went toe-to-toe with the Soviets in their most dominant sport, Olympic weightlifting. This battle would intensify into the 80s. In the Moscow Olympics, when the United States and other countries were boycotting, when the USSR would have its biggest medal haul, they were all just ripe for the taking. Bulgaria came in, won 4 gold medals and 2 silvers, taking more individual gold in weightlifting than the Soviets. To have this done on their home turf was an embarrassment. This all culminated in the 1986 World Championships when Bulgaria crushed the Soviets in team points, winning gold in 7 of 10 weight classes. So let's frame this up. The Soviet Union, in the middle of the Cold War, going toe-to-toe with the United States over the space race, over technological, economic, military supremacy, using all of their resources to make sure that they dominate the world stage to send a clear signal that they are the guys to beat on the block. And they're an absolute star sport. They not only lost, they lost badly. The Soviet Union had 241 million people. Bulgaria had 8 million. The Soviet Union had a couple of decades of the most high-minded intellectual approach to periodization that anybody could have ever concocted. The Bulgarian program? Lift like an unstable teenager who's using lifting as a form of self-harm and just max all your lifts 3 times a day, as many days in a row as you can without falling apart. The Bulgarian methods weren't just opposite from the Soviet system in the fact that they were very high intensity as opposed to very high volume. There was a shit ton of volume in the Bulgarian system, but it was all at absolute limit. Not only did they not give a rat's ass about technical proficiency, they were actually encouraged to put hitting new weights above everything else, to the point where many of their top athletes were hitting dozens of missed lifts in a single workout. But the Soviets would fall victim here to the same thing that they fell victim to throughout their entire run. A fetish for phony, high-minded intellectualism that is prioritizing things that look smart rather than actually understanding to the core the thing that you're doing. Ivan Abadjiev had an inkling that the body's transformative capabilities could be pushed the farthest if they relied on sheer intensity of will and maximizing stimulus in the most specific way possible. And with a team of disposable athletes, he turned out to be correct. Now keep in mind that this was not optimized for you, the individual. This was optimized for the group that needed to produce several world champions. If you have hundreds of people to choose from, you can tear through them like a Florida kid tearing through so much balsa wood. It was anticipated that so many people would burn out, and the ones that didn't would be your world champions. But for every teenager that's desperate to try this, and I did too at one point, understand that literally nobody trains like this. The odds that this would be sustainable for any one of you if you were actually on the Bulgarian team, getting massages, a stipend, getting a PED regimen, having all the motivation to represent your motherland against the Soviets, is infinitesimally small. The odds that you're going to do it without any of those things is exactly zero. Now, before Louis Simmons started misappropriating autistic Olympic lifting data into completely different sports, periodization had come to the West in a different form. Tudor Bompa was a Romanian sports scientist who was trained in the Eastern Bloc methods. He defected to Canada in the 70s and began translating and publishing extensively on periodization. His book, starting with Theory and Methodology of Training, the Key to Athletic Performance, simplified and adapted Matviev's theories for a Western audience, which means he watered them down for stupid Westerners. Now, this led to what we think of as the classical linear or Western model of periodization. It was close to the source of what Matveev had put together before it got corrupted with a million points of complexity. And it could be applied more intuitively without scaring off consumers. Decidedly Soviet tactics like the decoupling of volume and intensity were ditched because they were unnecessarily complex and hard to apply to a wide range of athletes. Instead, we took on simpler linear approaches that had a minimum amount of variation and direction to guarantee progress to people that adhered to it faithfully without having so much navel gazing that you would forget to actually lift the weight. And linear periodization had been used by some of the strongest men in history, including Bill Kazmaier, Kurt Karwoski, and the GOAT of powerlifting, Ed Cohn. In fact, Ed is known for his workman-like approach to training that says, "Keep it simple, stupid," and he proudly explains that his cycles were consistent and that he would run them on repeat without ever deviating.
Where did your approach come from?
I read all the magazines all the time. I just kind of made my body fit the routine and just busted my ass. That's pretty much all it is. And then tens, eights, fives, triples, doubles.
Yeah, that was
all
the
way
progression.
down. Yes.
But it was just typical, high volume to
and I would
high intensity.
I would follow my assistant's exercise the same way.
He would just start light and get heavier over time. Now, if you take any interview from Ed Cohn about his training and compare it to what you find in super training, it's like comparing Shakespeare to the Hungry Caterpillar. Now, there's two funny things that come out of this. This simple approach of watered-down Western periodization is often chided as the thing low-level lifters in the Soviet Union would do. It's like the kiddie table for lifting. Now, I'm not sure if that's supposed to be an insult to stupid Americans getting the high-minded science wrong, or if it just reinforces what we all know, that these methods are more appropriate for average consumers because they can actually be applied. And as you get elite, you figure out what works and you adapt it based on your own personal needs. Secondly, there's actually still an argument over whether or not this method has too much complexity. Like, lifters will still get perplexed by the thought of putting together blocks off of these vague concepts, and those who don't yet have a muscle to speak of will get on forums asking what Bompa meant by X, Y, or Z. There was one interview where Bompa was talking about training an elite athlete and having an epiphany during the process. The athlete got a good result, he saw that as validation and adopted that into his training moving forward uncritically without asking if he got a good result, because talented athletes tend to mostly give good results. When a poor soul in the starting strength forum made the mistake of asking Ripito what he thought, his response: Wikipedia lists 17 books for Dr. Bompa. Do any of them inform us about how to increase the deadlift? So to apply any of this, first and foremost, cut away the complexity. The one thing that is just absolutely unquestionably inappropriate for modern lifters is to mimic a training protocol that was given to lifters who were pre-selected for genetic talent, on a boatload of drugs, and living a very specific and catered to lifestyle. You are not being handled by a guy in a lab coat and having your workouts tracked to the quarter of a pound. Given the advantages the Soviets had and their failure to show dramatic improvement over the competition, there just isn't an excuse to sideline your training with whatever the hell you think you can pull out of something like super training. Simplicity is always going to be your friend. In fact, if you take anything, look at Bondarchuk, who actually did simplify the noise so that he could find metrics to tell him whether or not he was getting the right answer or not. Secondly, understand the context of these tactics. They are part of a general approach, not things you can just graft onto your own training. To implement any of these, you need to see training as skill acquisition, and that means you have to be comfortable leaving reps in the tank and doing lots and lots of working sets. There just isn't any Soviet mashup with your favorite HIIT program or anything that has a top set. Soviets lift weights the way golfers practice a swing. Now, in the context of that program, if that's the route you like to go, you can benefit from sustainability. Their training wasn't about chasing PRs every week or seeing who could go the hardest for a short period of time. Instead, it was built around the idea that your best gains come from steady, manageable effort over years. If you're interested in this type of training, the best resource you could go to is Boris Shiko's Foundations and Methods of Powerlifting. He was a Russian master of sport. He handled Olympic lifters. He took those methods, applied them to powerlifting, and he actually had really good results. The only reason this isn't more popular today is just because it's a lot of work. It's kind of monotonous. Now, I'd also tell more people to take to heart the recommendation to have most of your work sets at a reduced RPE for strength at least. I'm talking big barbell movements, smaller isolation stuff. Yeah, go ham. There's really not the cost. When you're talking about barbell movements, squats, deadlifts, cleans, overhead presses, there is a ton of value in leaving reps in the tank so that every set doesn't finish with you breaking open yet another hemorrhoid. It's important to know the spirit of all of this. A generalized approach to different phases is necessary for more complex sports. If you take a boxer who needs to be strong and explosive and really fast on their feet, but also have crazy endurance, but also learn just countless combinations and refine skill in each one, remember that weightlifting is really one-dimensional by comparison. I believe that phases for lifters are great for novelty, and one of the reasons I still use these frameworks is because of that. But when you understand that it's really not all the other high-minded stuff, then you're off the hook for following very precise blocks on definite timelines. And when you start reading something that's really complicated, you're justified in saying, this is stupid, closing the book and going and doing some work. Just ask, did you run 5 weeks of training that went off like gangbusters and you grew? No reason not to go through it again. Have you been cruising for a long time and things have gotten kind of stale? Switch into a different block. Expose yourself to novelty and allow yourself to start growing again. And the ways to do that in training without turning it into a complex clusterfuck are just too many to count. The block model's valuable, but it should be as flexible as you need it to be. So this is my all too long rant. Let's call it an essay. This was an essay on the Soviet sports system and why Soviet athletes were as good as they were. Hopefully this demystified a lot of the questions that you might have had about Soviet methods, about infamously complex books and theories and methodologies, and hopefully it gave you a little more confidence in doing whatever it is you're doing with your training.